Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're diving into something that, on the surface seems pretty simple. Should phones be banned in schools? But like most things we explore, the more you learn, the more you realize it's not so cut and dry, especially for those of us who, really care about fairness and looking at all sides of an issue.
Right. It's easy to jump to conclusions, but
Yeah,
there are always those nuances.
exactly. So what if I told you that these bans we hear so much about, what if they actually have some downsides that we don't always think about?
Hmm. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Right. So we're going to be digging into some fascinating research by Dr. Jema Hurix, and they make a really compelling argument that these bans, especially for our most vulnerable students, might be doing more harm than good.
That's a pretty bold claim. I'm interested to hear more.
Yeah. And one of the first things that jumped out to me was how Dr. Hurix really challenges that, that kind of knee-jerk reaction we have to phones in the classroom, that they're just these huge distractions.
Yeah, we've all heard that a million times.
Yeah. Right. But instead of just being about, like, you know, goofing off and playing games, the research really highlights all these other ways that phones have become super important tools for students, ways we might not even think about.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
So think about it. A student with dyslexia, right? They might be using their phone's text-to-speech function to access the exact same material as their classmates. But then, boom, a ban comes along.
And suddenly they're at a huge disadvantage.
Exactly. It's like we're taking away one of their tools for success.
And that's where this whole conversation about digital equity and accessibility comes in. We talk a lot about giving every student a fair shot. And in today's world, that absolutely includes recognizing that for many students, especially those from, let's say, disadvantaged backgrounds, a phone isn't a luxury. It's their lifeline to education.
It's their way to be on an even playing field.
Exactly. And the technology that's packed into these devices. Think about it. Features like text-to-speech or even OCR, which, if you're not familiar, lets you scan printed text and have it read aloud or turned into digital text. These can be absolute game changers. It's really about making sure everybody has the same opportunities to learn, to succeed.
And I think we can all agree that that's important. But then there's this other side to it, right? That whole idea of digital dependency. Phones are kind of notorious for feeding into those constant dopamine hits. Makes you wonder, like, are we setting these kids up for some kind of withdrawal if we just yeet that away?
It's a valid concern, and honestly, it's a really complex issue. Because on the one hand, you have this incredibly powerful tool that, yeah, can be distracting, but also offers a lot of potential benefits. And then on the other hand, you have this very real concern about addiction and dependence.
So where do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, let's start with the dopamine piece, because it's all about understanding how our brains are wired, right? So dopamine, it's that feel-good chemical, that rush you get when you experience something pleasurable, rewarding. And let's be real, phones are practically designed to tap into that. Every notification, every scroll through social media, it's like this little burst of dopamine.
It's like they figured out the formula, right?
And then the question becomes, if we just remove that, are we really solving the problem? Or are we creating a whole new set of challenges?
Right, because are we getting to that root cause of why a student might be disengaged in class, or are we just taking away something without giving them a real alternative?
And that's what makes this such a difficult conversation, because there are no easy answers.
And it's like, it gets even more complicated, when we start thinking about those students who rely on these devices, not just for like staying organized or getting those little dopamine hits, but for reasons that are like fundamental to their ability to learn.
Right, it's not always just about entertainment or social media.
Exactly. And the research really dives into how these blanket phone bans, they could actually be creating more barriers for students with disabilities. Because for some of them, their phone isn't just part of their social life. It's practically like interwoven with how they
It
learn.
becomes an essential tool.
Yeah. Like the research gives an example of a student who relies on text-to-speech software to even be able to access the material. So if we suddenly say, nope, no phones allowed, it's like, are we really putting them at a disadvantage for something that's like essential to them?
And that's where I think this whole discussion starts to bump up against some really important ethical considerations, because we
Right.
talk a lot about creating inclusive learning environments, but a policy like this could actually be doing the opposite.
Instead of being inclusive,
It's exclusive
Right.
and potentially even discriminatory.
wow.
Think about it. Imagine being a student who, in order to use a tool that helps you learn, you have to disclose a disability. You might have to answer questions that make you feel awkward or even uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's like putting them on the spot.
Exactly. And the research even mentioned that for some students, phone use might have to be written into their IEP.
Their IEP, so that's, remind me again.
Right. So an IEP is an individualized education program. Basically, it's a plan that outlines how a school will support a student's learning needs. So we're talking about adding another layer of complexity for these families to navigate, just so their child can have equal access to education.
It just seems like there could be a simpler way, you know?
Right. And that's the thing. We have to ask ourselves, are these bans really the most effective solution?
It makes you wonder, like, taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture here, who are these bans really benefiting? Because one thing Dr. Horrocks touches on that I found really interesting was how big tech companies might actually be playing a role in this whole debate, which I don't know about you, but that kind of blew my mind a little bit.
It's definitely something to think about. Are we really acting in the best interests of students, or are there other factors at play here? You know, Dr. Horrocks uses the example of the campaign against TikTok.
Oh, yeah, I remember that whole thing.
Right. And while there were definitely some valid concerns about, its impact on attention spans, especially for younger users, the research also points out that some of the loudest voices calling for bans were actually competing tech companies.
So it's like this whole other layer of...
Of competition, yeah, where TikTok was seen as a threat.
So it's like we're talking about a digital turf war, basically, and students are caught in the crossfire.
That's a really good way to put it. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this idea of critical thinking, right? We can't just accept things at face value. We have to be willing to dig a little deeper, to ask those tough questions about who benefits, who might be disadvantaged, and what the unintended consequences might be. Because it's often a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
It really makes you wonder, are we so busy, freaking out about all the bad stuff that could happen with phones that we're missing a chance, like a chance to actually teach kids how to use this technology well? Because like it or not, it's not going away anytime soon, right?
It's like we're constantly playing catch up, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being proactive, thinking about how we can integrate technology in a healthy way, we jump to these extreme solutions. At least that's what it feels like sometimes.
So it sounds like, and I think Dr. Horrocks kind of hints at this too, maybe instead of banning phones outright, schools should be the ones, leading the charge on digital literacy.
That's exactly what Dr. Horrocks argues. Because we can't just ignore the problem, right?
Yeah.
But instead of confiscation, imagine if we were actually giving students the tools, the skills they need to navigate this digital world.
But what would that look like? Like, how do you even begin to teach digital literacy? It feels kind of vague when you say it like that.
Well, think about it this way. What if instead of confiscating phones, we were actually using that time, that energy, to teach kids how to evaluate information they see online? How to spot a scam, or even just basic stuff like managing your time, your attention when you're bombarded with notifications and updates.
It's like we're so worried about the amount of time they're spending on their phones, but we're not actually teaching them how to use that time well, how to be mindful, how to think critically about what they're seeing and doing. It's like we skip over that whole part.
It's a huge missed opportunity, for sure. And I think it goes back to what we were discussing earlier, about that root cause of student disengagement,
Right.
because it's probably a lot more complex than just like, phones are evil, get them out of here.
Okay, so if we're not going to ban them, what's the alternative? Like, what does Dr. Horrocks suggest we do instead?
Well, towards the end of the research, they pose this really interesting question, and I'm going to try to do it justice. Dr. Horrocks asks, instead of banning phones, how can we create learning environments that are so engaging, so inclusive, and so effectively leverage technology that phones just fade into the background?
Whoa. That's a pretty big challenge, isn't it? It's like flipping the script completely. Instead of feeling technology, we figure out how to make it work for us, not against us.
Right. And that's what I love about these kinds of conversations, these deep dives. They make you challenge your assumptions, look at things from different angles, and hopefully they get people talking, Because real change, meaningful change, that comes from dialogue, from being open to new ways of thinking.
It's not about having all the answers, right? It's about asking the right questions. And those questions, well, they can be kind of uncomfortable sometimes, but it's worth it.
Absolutely.
So next time you hear someone say, just ban the phones, remember everything we've talked about today? It's a lot more nuanced, a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance.
It really is.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time when we unpack another thought-provoking topic, something that's sure to spark your curiosity and hopefully leave you with more questions than answers.